I decided I was going to go to Alaska back many years ago, back even when I was a young man. But it was a lifelong desire, lifelong goal. And I found a school there that had a fishery science major. So in 1983, I enrolled in Sheldon Jackson College in Sitka, Alaska, and graduated a couple years later. In 1985, I was offered a position to run a hatchery on the south end of Baranof Island, a chum hatchery, in fact. So it was a two-family operation. My son, Ricky, at the time was not quite a year old. The other family and my wife had gone to town for supplies, and a storm hit and blew, blowing 70, 75 miles per hour. The hatchery was situated at the base of a mountain, but the wind caught trees at the top of the mountain and initiated a tree slide. And this was in the middle of the night, and a very large Sitka spruce landed immediately adjacent to the house, almost literally knocked me out of bed. But I ran down the other end of the house where my son Ricky was in his crib, and opened the door, and he was sitting up in bed. As it turns out, a large Sitka spruce had landed within inches of the exterior wall to his bedroom. In any case, I grabbed Ricky without having time to really gather any supplies. I carried him out the door and ran out to where we had a boat tied up at the end of a long dock, which made us relatively safe in terms of distance from falling trees. However, it was in winter, and we ended up staying out on the boat, a metal small runabout, for the next several days. And of course, I was able to eventually get back up to the house and get some supplies and clothes. But that first night was the only thing we had was life jackets to wrap around us to try to stay warm. The next morning, as during daylight, you could see that the house was demolished, completely demolished. Eventually, Coast Guard came down and rescued Ricky. And then we ended up having to close the hatchery because it had damaged the water supply line. After graduation from Sheldon Jackson College, I was offered a job at the Metlakatla Indian Community. This was the largest tribal salmon fishery in the nation. That was kind of consistent with my career goals, so I took the job, and we relocated to Metlakatla, which is to the south of Sitka, which is where we were living. And we ended up living in Metlakatla for 13 years, where I served initially as the fishery management biologist, a position that had not previously existed there in the tribe, and then eventually became the director of the Department of Fish and Wildlife, of a department that had not previously existed. In fact, I guess I was the very first biologist to be hired directly by the tribe. One of the dangers associated with doing escapement counts during salmon season, we would go out and walk the creeks doing an actual count to the extent that we can on the number of salmon we saw in each of these major creeks. But one of the dangers is that it's abundant food supply that lots of wildlife, bears and wolves and others, rely upon. And your chances of encountering wolves was actually pretty high, probably higher than even bears. We had several wolf encounters. One in particular I'm reminded of where my dog and I were walking creek, counting fish, and my dog ran ahead of me and almost out of sight, in fact. And as I was walking along, I looked up and noticed that there were a bunch of figures bouncing in my general direction. I couldn't really tell what they were, but it was certainly more than one. And as they got closer, I recognized my dog, Nicky, but there were probably 9 or 10 additional figures that I couldn't make out that were moving along behind her. Eventually, as they got closer, I recognized that what I was looking at was wolves. And they were chasing my dog, and she did manage to outrun them, but they were hot on her heels. And she came and ran, got right between my legs, my back against the creek, and the wolves, and there were about 9 to 10 adults that I saw, formed a semicircle around us with the alpha male clearly in the middle. And they were obviously interested in my dog. And we ended up actually backing into the creek, which is not an easy thing to do using, we had a walking stick. You just don't want to give them any reason to take advantage of a fall or anything of that sort. But we ended up backing out down the creek. We did it effectively, and they would not get any closer than about a dozen feet or so, but they were very, very interested in my dog. I don't think they were particularly interested in me, but I didn't know that at the time, and it was quite a memorable experience. When I finally decided to leave Alaska, it was not as much that I wanted to leave Alaska, but it was a job opportunity that I could not afford to turn down. I was offered the regional biologist position with the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Portland, Oregon. And quite honestly, there were several reasons why I had considered leaving in any case. My sons were were in high school, and I didn't want my sons to have only fishing as their only professional opportunity. And so I wanted to get them down to a place where they had other options to consider. Naturally, I found myself desperately missing Alaska, and there was no question that if I hadn't been married and didn't have children, I probably would never have left. If I had to do it all over again, I might make changes about things that I did, but I would still do the whole fishery management, Metlakatla, Alaska thing all over it. The most extraordinary moments of my life, for the most part, occurred while I was in Alaska, and to be more specific, while I was out on the herring grounds. But yeah, I have no regrets for going to Alaska. I still, in retrospect, believe it was one of the best things I ever did.